Police arresting nearly 50 protesters outside of a federal building in Minneapolis as Homeland Security warns of escalating attacks on ICE agents. The senior correspondent, Steve Harrigan, live in Minneapolis with the latest from there. Steve.
Kevin, that protest out in front of the federal building in Minneapolis turned violent after protesters were told to disperse. At least 42 people were arrested when they were told they had to break it up. Many began throwing bottles and ice at the federal agents. At least one agent wounded, one patrol car smashed up, one protester arrested for assault. In the meantime here, these daily protests are really taking a toll on the local economy, especially small businesses and restaurants having a hard time. Local entrepreneurs trying to encourage people to buy local, many saying that this is worse for businesses than even COVID was.
My co-founder and I stopped by a restaurant on our street and ended up filling to-go orders for them because more than 50% of his staff is gone, afraid to come to work for fear of being taken by ICE, even as U.S. citizens, even with work permits, even with the right paperwork.
We've lived through this before during COVID in 2020 following the murder of George Floyd, and we're living through it again, and this time it's worse.
700 ICE agents were pulled out on Wednesday. That still leaves 2,000 here. So far, no public timeline on when they will be leaving. Kevin, back to you.
Stay warm or do the best you can. Steve Harrigan up in Minneapolis. Thank you, my friend. We appreciate that. Joining me now is Chad Wolf, former DHS Secretary and America First Policy Institute Executive Director. Always a pleasure to have you with us because I know you understand better than most the severity of the circumstance in Minneapolis. We're not just talking about trying to rid the homeland of individuals who have no right to be here, but have also, Chad, created havoc on this nation and on its people. That's why what's happening there is such an important storyline, even at this hour. You saw Steve there talking about the removal of some of these protesters. That seems to be a bit of a shift or maybe a bit of tightening on their policy, and it seems to be working. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the ongoing violent protest, you just reported you had 40 individuals arrested because of that violence. I think this is a real problem for Minneapolis and for those Democratic leaders there, because what they have been telling the American people is that those protests are peaceful and that if ICE withdraws, then some of that protest and some of the violence, I should say, can abate. And it doesn't seem to be the case. So what we need now is we need the leadership of the Democratic Party to come out and start saying, stop with the violent protesting, stop with the violence there in Minneapolis. Because as Tom Homan has said, if the violence subsides, then they can draw down even more resources there in Minneapolis, which is what those leaders want. But if that violence continues, as we see, that the numbers aren't going to dwindle. In fact, they're likely to go up because you need to protect those officers. So now is the time that you need Democratic leaders to say enough is enough. We're going to send in the police. We're going to arrest the violent protesters immediately. We're going to hold them accountable. And now is the time for them to start speaking out.
Is this a federal law circumstance? Because I think the concern from some, Chad, would be you're going to arrest these guys. They're just going to be back out on the streets in a couple of hours.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's going to be prosecuted at the local level for the most part, unless, you've got federal law enforcement and prosecutors that want to weigh in. It depends on the types of things that they're being arrested for. If they're assaulting federal officers, obviously a federal prosecutor can get involved. If they're doing other things that are more locally based, then some of the local prosecutors will eventually prosecute that. But the concern is, yes, absolutely, they go in jail and then they just simply get out in a matter of hours. I think that is the concern. And so you need the Trump administration weighing in with the local leaders, talking to the governor, talking to the mayor, and talking to others to say, look, we're doing our part. We've withdrawn some ICE assets here because we told you if the violence starts to diminish, we can remove even more. But if the violence stays the same or is increasing, that's a real problem for the leaders there in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and a lot of people felt like, well, they changed. They took a 700-person drawdown. But listen, more than 2,000 people still on the ground trying to affect a change in what's been happening there. And give Tom Homan credit. Here's a guy who has come in, Chad, and really sort of shifted the narrative just a bit. And again, and I think the messaging is part of this. We're not talking about running around to some office building or some restaurant. We're talking about getting the worst of the worst out of this country, off the streets, and no longer a danger to its citizens.
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, the president's decision to send Tom in it was a stroke of genius, and Tom has been able to go in over this past week or more with a very calm voice, so a really rational response, outlining what it is ICE was going to do, shifting some resources, shifting some of the operational requirements there on the ground. And I think the American people are starting to realize that. But now is the time for Minneapolis to do their part. Now is the time for the local leaders to do their part and make sure that the violence does not get out of control and that they are stepping in and putting an end to it, because then that cooperation can continue. But if you see a spike in some of the violent activity there, DHS is going to, it's going to protect its officers. And so those resources, the 2,000 or so that remain, are likely not going anywhere if that violence continues.
Absolutely. And you have to do what you can and what you obviously are required to do, and that is protect this country from those who might harm us. And by the way, for the record, you mentioned Tom Holman. He's obviously also working now with counties to make sure that they can, again, take this sort of out of the public purview. Let's get the people who are already in custody out of there as quickly as possible.